In the last lecture, we talked about how movement is planned by rostral areas of the frontal lobe. And then we basically have three systems that are actually going to allow us to make a motor movement. So we have our pyramidal system, which again is our direct and indirect cortical spinal pathways. We have extrapyramidal system, which is very, very complicated and has a large number of individual nuclei complexly interconnected. And last of all, we have the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is just an incredible structure. This is one of the best studied areas of the entire brain. And there are many neurologists who refer to this structure as a neuronal machine. And I think by the end of the lecture, you'll understand why they call it this. So let's see first of all, what's so impressive about the cerebellum? Well, have a glance at this. Of the 100 billion neurons in the human brain, half of them at least are packed into the cerebellum. So the cerebellum here that we originally used in this class in early lectures just to talk about so that you could tell the back of the brain from the front of the brain. This tiny structure down here has 50 billion neurons packed in it. And so we always knew that it was important, and many early neurobiologists were very important in determining what the functions of the cerebellum are. Now, it has many functions, but for human beings, most of the functions that we focus on will be a maintenance of equilibrium and posture. So an individual who has particular lesions in the cerebellum is not able to stand straight like this. They'll have a rotated posture, and they won't be able to right themselves. So equilibrium and posture is extremely important. The second thing, which is very important in human beings, is the timing of learned skilled motor movement. Now, if you think about this, there's a timing that is involved in movement. You have to have appropriate contraction of the appropriate muscles at the appropriate time, and also with the right force. So you don't want to come down like this on something. You need to have the movement be smooth, directed, but with the appropriate force. And last of all, one of the most important things the cerebellum does and contributes to our lives because of all the things we like to do is the cerebellum is going to be involved in the correction of errors during ongoing movement. So as you're going to make a learned, skilled, fine motor movement, your cerebellum's getting feedback and saying, no, you need to extend your arm a little farther. So it's making changes or correcting errors that occur as the movement is ongoing. Think about that for a moment. What must be involved in this? So our cerebellum is this little fist-sized guy back here in the posterior part of the brain. And the term cerebellum actually means little cerebrum. It means little cerebrum. So here's our cerebrum, and this is our little cerebrum. Well, there has to be a reason why the early neuroanatomists decided to call it that, and indeed, there is a reason. So, if we look at the ways that the cerebellum is like the cerebrum, there are a number of them. One is that there's two hemispheres. Just like you have a hemisphere in the cerebrum and another one over here, you have two hemispheres in the cerebellum. Also, the cerebellum is covered by a cerebellar cortex. So it's covered by a sheet of cells, the cerebellar cortex, just like the cerebrum is covered by a cortex. And early neuroanatomists obviously noticed this. You also have underneath that sheet of cells just what you have underneath the sheet of cells here. You have a massive amount of white matter or pathways that are coursing. So you have underlying white matter beneath the cortex. So these were major ways that early neuroanatomists could see that it was the same. There are other ways as well that the cerebellum is like the cortex. So it has this overlying mantle, and then you have very deep fissures that are going to divide the cerebellar cortex into lobes. And we saw that fissures and everything divided the cerebral cortex into lobes. Now, you want to think about the cerebellum, however, what you need to think about is taking a piece of paper and then squishing it up like this so that it's only fist-sized. So you're taking a huge amount of area and making it very small. And estimates have been made. People have actually dissected out the cerebellar cortex. The surface area of the cerebellar cortex is 75% of that of the cerebral cortex. And it turns out these fissures in the cerebellum are extremely deep. And this allows for this huge amount of cerebellar cortex to be involved in this little tiny structure here, just like that, just like our crumpled piece of paper. Now, just like areas of the cortex again, different areas of the cerebellum are of different ages. Now, the way this occurs is different in the two structures, but the concept is still the same. So you have ancient areas of the cerebellum that occur in animals like alligators. In fact, alligators have been one of the animals that is most widely used in research on the cerebellum. So you have old areas of the cerebellum, and then you have newer areas of the cerebellum. And it's obviously the newer areas of the cerebellum that play a role primarily in man. Now, you might ask, why is it that an animal like an alligator has been widely used in the study of the cerebellum, particularly old areas of the cerebellum? Well, alligators have this incredible ability, you see, to do something incredible with their jaws. And this is regulated by the cerebellum. So alligators are capable of carrying an egg for miles in their mouth without breaking it. Now, this is pretty incredible because that same jaw can break the femur of a buffalo. And the cerebellum controls, under both conditions, the force of the bite. And so little baby alligators are commonly used to study this structure. Now, just like the cerebrum, we also have multiple maps. That should make sense to you too. If this structure is going to coordinate motor movement, it needs to have motor maps, it's going to need somatosensory maps, it's going to need all kinds of maps that either map out part of the body surface or map some aspect of something. If it's going to correct errors during ongoing movement, it's going to need to get visual information, it's going to get lots of information, otherwise it wouldn't know to correct an error in movement. So it's getting all this sensory input, it's getting motor input, and there are multiple maps. Now, there are also ways that these early neuroanatomists didn't know at the time, but there are also ways that the cerebellum is very, very different from the cerebrum or the hemispheres. So, for example, the cerebellar cortical organization is going to be very different than the cortex and the cerebrum. First of all, the cerebellar cortex is made up of 3 layers throughout. Remember, for the cerebral cortex had 3 layers in some places, it had 6 layers in other places, and then how those cells were arranged made up Brodmann's areas. Well, the cerebellum has no Brodmann areas. So the cerebellar cortex is exactly the same wherever you cut it and wherever you look at it. So let's look at it and see what it does look like. This is the cerebellar cortex, and it has the same 3 layers anywhere you cut through it. This would be the surface of the cerebellar area up here. This would be tissue of the cortex, which would be found deep in one of the fissures. This would be the surface of it. It has a molecular layer, which is where a lot of synapses are taking place. It has a single row of cells called Purkinje cells. And these neurons, this is obviously a cell stain, so you only see the cell body. These neurons are going to have huge dendrites that extend up into this molecular layer. So there's going to be a lot of inputs to these dendrites. And then underneath it is the 3rd layer of the cerebellum, which is called the granule cell layer. And early neuroanatomists did give the name to this. Granule means grain. And there are literally billions of tiny, tiny little inner neurons that are located here in this area. Now, the Purkinje cell layer is a very interesting one. The Purkinje cell layer was named for Johannes Purkinje, who was a bohemian neuroscientist, neurophysiologist, and anatomist, who named a lot of structures throughout the body, gave his name to a number of structures throughout the body. Purkinje cells are one of them. So this is a Golgi impregnated section, and now you can see right in this area here would be a deep fissure. So this would be the surface of the cerebellar cortex right here. This would be the granule cell layer down here. Here's our Purkinje cell layer. So remember with Golgi impregnation, the silver only fills about 1% of all the cells that are present. And that means you can cut thick sections, and what you get is this incredible image of these unbelievably complex dendrites that extend up into the molecular layer. So this is the molecular layer, then the Purkinje cell layer, then the granule cell layer. These Purkinje cell dendrites are very interesting. They are literally called candelabra neurons. And they're a specific neuronal type that occur only in the cerebellum. And they have huge dendritic branches that come up from the cell body and many secondary, tertiary branches. And literally thousands of synapses are being made onto each one of these Purkinje cells. So Purkinje cells are extremely interesting. Another thing that's interesting about them, in the way the cortex of the cerebellum is organized differently than the cortex in the cerebrum, is that the Purkinje cells, that one layer of those big neurons that get all that input to their dendrites, those are the only neurons in the cerebellar cortex to project out of the cortex of the cerebellum. So all of the output of the cerebellar cortex will be via that one neuron type, only those neurons. Now, what that implies is that there's a huge amount of integration going on in the cerebellum. And indeed, half of the neurons of the brain, up to 50 to 70 billion neurons, are found in that one structure, but there's only 15 million cells that project out of it. And what this says is there's a huge amount of integration. All those little grain neurons, those billions of little grain cells, are all interneurons that are integrating what's going on. And that's just a fundamental, fascinating thing about this structure. And this is why neuroscientists are just really interested in how the cerebellum works. It helps coordinate motor movement, and it does it by being able to integrate information coming in. But only 15 million neurons are going to project out to do anything. And so that says it's a very, very highly integrative structure. Now let's look at what projects to the cerebellum in a little bit more detail. Well, you could have guessed that you can't coordinate a motor movement if you don't know what motor movement got initiated by motor cortex. Does that make sense? So inputs to the cerebellum are going to be from area 4. So the cortical spinal tract is going to peel collaterals off. On its way down to the spinal cord, it's going to peel collaterals off that are going to synapse in the pons, and then the pons is going to project to the cerebellum. Do you remember what the term pons meant? Pons means bridge. And early neuroanatomists gave it that name because the pons is going to connect the brain with the cerebellum. And so that's where the term pons got its name. And that is indeed a major source of input to the cerebellum. You can't coordinate a movement if you don't know what movement's been initiated. So this is how the motor cortex tells the cerebellum. Now, you also have many nuclei in this extrapyramidal motor system. They may not project to the spinal cord, but they have complicated projections to the cerebellum. And so here again, you have motor programs being set into play, all those complicated nuclei of the extrapyramidal system doing their thing, but they're going to communicate with the cerebellum as well. And lastly, you need a lot of sensory input. If you're going to modify a movement during the ongoing movement, for example, if I want to reach over and touch area 4 on our little brain model, then the movement I initially make is very gross and not very specific. But if I want to reach up and just touch area 4 like this, that takes a massive amount of input, including that from my visual system. I don't turn like this and then feel around, where's area 4? I'm using my eyes. So the cerebellum is going to have visual input. And notice, as I move my arm, proprioceptors in my joints and everything are feeding information in as well. As I look at area 4 and I go to touch it like this, the cerebellum is helping me change that movement as it's ongoing, so I touch just area 4. I don't do this and then come back to area 4. Okay? So the cerebellum is responsible for this, and this is just really incredible. Now, let's look at the output of the cerebellum. So the cerebellum, just like the extrapyramidal motor system, interestingly enough, has no connections to the spinal cord. So here it is, adjusting movement that's ongoing, but it has no connections to the spinal cord for the body. How does it do that? Well, it's going to be involved in those same kind of the forward feedback systems and all kinds of interconnections with other nuclei, and that's how it's going to influence, and guess what it ultimately wants to influence? The pyramidal pathways, either direct or indirect. Why would you think that was so? Well, they're the only ones that are going to project to the spinal cord. So the cerebellum, again, is going to be involved in these circuits that are going to feed back to motor cortex. So the cerebellum has its own nuclei in the thalamus that has a massive projection there. And those areas project again up to area 4 and then modify what movement is initiated. So think of each second as you're going to make a movement. Each second as I'm making, actually much smaller than that, each millisecond as I'm doing this, there are these feedback circuits telling me whether or not the movement I'm making is the appropriate movement. Is this what I want to make? And my motor cortex initiating the movement, and these other systems making sure that the movement the motor cortex wants to initiate is the actual one that ends up being made. And that should impress you the next time you do the simplest thing that involves learned skilled motor movement in particular. Think about what must be involved in being able to do that. It is just incredible. So we say that the cerebellum is involved in the coordination of learned skilled motor movement. So let's just look at that for a minute. Notice that it's learned skilled motor movement. So essentially what you want to do as you learn a new movement, think of playing racquetball or skiing or doing something like that. As you learn how to make these new movements, what you're doing is setting up neural circuits in your cerebellum. And with practice, those circuits will become sort of solidified, if you will. And what happens is, now when you go to make the movement, and when you've practiced, whether it's playing the piano, any learned skilled motor movement, you're going to have a series of Purkinje cells that are going to fire off in a sequence. Just like that, as you make that learned skilled motor movement. And the more practice you have, then the better those underlying neural circuits are. And so this is what helps you make a better and better and better learned skilled motor movement. So let's think about what happens when you learn how to walk. When you look at a little kid, a little baby, when they're learning how to walk, they're very uncoordinated. And they slap their little feet down and they fall, and they can't coordinate their movement. And you see it when they reach up to try to touch something. The movement isn't coordinated. As they practice, and you're helping them, come on, like that, all of a sudden, they're able to coordinate the movement. And that's because a series of Purkinje cells fire when you make a learned skilled motor movement. And initially, walking is a learned skilled motor movement. So the cerebellum plays a critical role in this. Now, this is true in skiing, it's true in golf. One of the reasons I like to watch Tiger Woods play, he has an incredibly consistent swing. And he doesn't just have talent. He spent an enormous amount of time practicing that swing so that the swing is the same each time. And the better players are the ones with the consistent swing. Well, it's a cerebellum that's allowing him to do this. My medical students always make a joke because I always say that I could never watch Michael Jordan and I can't watch Tiger Woods without thinking, what a beautiful cerebellum these men have. I mean, it's just incredible. When Michael Jordan would jump and he would lift his arms like this and he would go like this towards the hoop, there was the cerebellum telling him exactly how to do it so that that learned skilled motor movement resulted in the ball going into the basket. Any motor movement that improves with practice is governed by the cerebellum. And so this is why you want to practice things. Practice really makes a difference. It is going to reinforce those underlying neural circuits that then when you go to make the movement, it will allow, in fact, these circuits to be set off. It's also why you can learn how to ride a bicycle as a kid, then not ride a bicycle for 40 years, get back on, and you might, 5 minutes or so, and you're wobbling around a little bit, and then suddenly you're off. And that's because the cerebellum starts kicking in those Purkinje cells that were originally all firing off together when you used to zoom around on your bicycle when you were a kid. And lo and behold, no time flat. You haven't been on a bicycle in 40 years, and there you are just going down the road. And so this is an incredible structure, and you obviously see why neuroscientists are so excited about it. And let me tell you another little thing about the cerebellum, because this really brings home what happens as we do something and lets you know, it's not just playing sports and things like that, but how important the cerebellum is to so much that's important to human beings. So, for example, when you learn how to play the piano, when you first learn how to play the piano, first of all, there you're confronted with a piece of sheet music that's got a bunch of squiggles on it that don't mean anything to you. So you're going to need areas of your brain that learn to translate that into something that makes sense. That's incredible that the brain does that. And then when you first start to play, you're uncoordinated, and notice that when you play the piano, that you look down, say you want to hit E flat in the bass. You turn your head and you look at E flat, thereby losing your place in the sheet music, of course. But you turn your head like this, and then you reach down and you touch E flat. If you practice, you practice and you practice and you practice, one day you're looking at the music and you need E flat, you just reach down and you hit it. Because your little cerebellum is saying, that's exactly how far E flat is. And so you need to extend your arm and then make this fine movement and hit E flat, just like that. If you watch professional pianists, you'll notice that they take a great deal of time at the very beginning, sitting themselves just the way they want to, right in front of middle C. And the reason they're spending all this time adjusting their bodies and adjusting where they're at on that piano bench is because their cerebellum is going to set off circuits saying exactly how far E is away. If they sit randomly on the piano bench, the cerebellum wouldn't be able to do it. You'd have to look and see where E was at. So basically, any of these things, learn skilled motor movement, playing a musical instrument, the sports that human beings love to engage in. These are all things that require a functioning cerebellum. And I just have to say this. I love to dance. I absolutely love to dance. We couldn't dance through life without a cerebellum. And so the cerebellum is critical for a lot of things that are very expressive for human beings and about what they like to do. So, what happens when there are clinical disorders of the cerebellum? So what happens to a person who has a cerebellar damage for one reason or another? We have to turn again to the clinic and have a look and see. Now, what can go wrong in a patient has a lot to do with what areas of the cerebellum are involved, but here I just want to talk about in general. So what kinds of things affect the cerebellum? Well, you could have a stroke. And I hope that all my students in this class could guess and anticipate that it would be the posterior part of the blood supply, part of the vertebral system, that would supply the cerebellum with blood. So you could have a stroke. You could have a tumor in your cerebellum. Cerebellum is central nervous system tissue, so astrocytes are oligodendrocytes. And actually, tumors are very common in children in the cerebellum. So the cerebellum isn't fully developed with birth, and this is one of the areas that often has tumors in children. You could have a neurological disorder that's genetically transmitted. One is called Friedreich's ataxia, and the individual is very uncoordinated, but it doesn't show up until the person's like a teenager. And you'll see a very common scenario would be, for example, a 16-year-old boy who's always been playing basketball, and suddenly one year he doesn't make the team. And that's because something is going wrong with his cerebellum and he's no longer coordinated. And this disease shows itself in teenage years. This is when it gets diagnosed. You could have vitamin E deficiency. If you lived in a part of the world where you didn't get enough vitamin E, you could have cerebellar problems. You could have a viral infection. There's an infection that pregnant women get that's similar to parvovirus, which is seen in cats. And this disorder causes the selective degeneration of Purkinje cells and granule cells in the cerebellum. And this is, of course, in the fetus that the woman is carrying. You can also have trauma to the cerebellum. One of the interesting little pieces of trivia in neuroscience is the very first description of cerebellar damage was of a knight who'd been hit in the head with a mace. And he became very uncoordinated afterwards because the mace hit him in the back of the head, and this is what happened. And last of all, you can drink alcohol. So if you want to make your cerebellum not work, all you have to do is have a couple of drinks. And I'll come back to that in a minute about how we know that. But alcohol is one of the main ways that actually there are death to cerebellar neurons. If you drink long enough and enough of alcohol, you will in fact kill Purkinje cells and other cells in your cerebellum. And the consequence of that, of course, being that long-term alcoholics who then stop drinking alcohol often are uncoordinated even after they've stopped drinking because they've killed the cerebellar neurons. And what do all my students in this class know? Neurons are not replaced. And so if you kill them, they're gone. So let's think about some common signs and symptoms that you would see in someone. And this is how doctors would check this in you. You go into them and you say, I keep knocking things over or whatever. They're going to check your cerebellar function. Well, one of the things you see in cerebellar dysfunction is something called dysmetria. And dysmetria means an abnormal timing of your motor movement. So this is generally tested by the finger to nose test in a doctor's office. So I have a pretty good cerebellum, so I can do this very quickly. Now, I always tell my medical students, if you really think someone has cerebellar damage, don't do this. Because a person with cerebellar damage can't time the appropriate motor movement. So as the person gets close to the finger, their arm starts moving like this, and they'll past point or they'll end too soon. So the timing of contraction, all of this is being regulated by the cerebellum. So if you think someone really does have cerebellar damage, don't test it this way, because people stick their finger in their eyes. So people injure themselves. So this is dysmetria. This is my favorite medical term, dysdiadochokinesia, and that refers to a decomposition of movement, abnormal composition of movement. This is tested by asking someone to do something simple like this. So the person simply turns their hand back and forth. Notice how smoothly I can do this. And you think, wow, that's a pretty simple movement. Well, people who have cerebellar damage break it into its component pieces like this, and they can't make a smooth movement. Another thing that happens is you have abnormal rhythm to your movement. And the best example, of course, would be Steve Martin in The Jerk. How he couldn't keep time to the music and clap his hands at the same time and everything. That's a perfect kind of thing. But that isn't how we test it in a doctor's office. How we test is this. We might ask the patient, I want you to tap your finger 3 fast times and 1 slow time. 1, 2, 3, 1. 1, 2, 3, 1. I can do that with no trouble. Person who has cerebellar damage can't do that. And ataxia? Ataxia is a lack of coordination. So this is what will be tested if you are stopped by the police and they think you're driving erratically and they think that you are under the influence of alcohol. What they ask you to do is walk in tandem, and that means 1 foot in front of the other. And I can do this pretty well even in heels, but 1 foot in front of the other. A person who is inebriated can't do that because they can't coordinate their movement. So they try to do this and they're totally thrown off. They can't coordinate their motor movement. And so that's what the police are actually checking for, is cerebellar function. The police don't know that, of course, but that is what they're checking for. And the last thing that occurs, which is very important to point out, is intention tremor. Intention tremor means that as the person comes to the end of a movement, of a learned, skilled motor movement, and to make an intentional movement, I want to touch that. As they get closer and closer, they're unable to stop a tremor or a movement of their hand or their arm like this. So they try to go down like this, and they can't do it. If they have a cup of coffee in their hand, the gross movement might be all right as they bring it to their face, but as they get very close to their mouth, the cup starts moving like this. And of course, people injure themselves. So we call it an intention tremor because the tremor gets worse as you try to make an intentional movement. Now, lastly, I can't talk about the cerebellum without letting you know this. Turns out that in modern neuroscience, what we're finding out is that the cerebellum plays a role in almost everything that's going on in the brain. From language to being able to view our environment in a way that allows us to make a specific motor response, just about everything is regulated on some level somehow by the cerebellum. And we're discovering that disorders as far apart as autism, attention deficit disorder, and many other disorders, you see damage to the cerebellum. So this is a very active area of research in neuroscience. Thank you.